So, Paul, this one keeps coming up in client work, the Eisenhower Matrix.
Yeah.
I want to make sure we're using it the right way. Did Eisenhower actually invent it, or did we retrofit his quote into a tool?
Hey, Matt. Hey, everybody. Um, Eisenhower Matrix. So I guess let's start with what it is for people that are not fully familiar with it. If you've ever seen a presentation from a business consultant anywhere worth their salt, you've seen something called a 2x2. So a 2x2 is it's got 4 quadrants. The 4 quadrants mean something different. I've created a fair few 2x2s in my time, and our brains can kind of naturally adjust to it. So there'll be a couple of different dimensions and so on. Eisenhower Matrix is a good example of that. So the 2 dimensions are urgency and importance. And so if you think about that, you've got these 2 axes, a important axis and an urgent axis. And though the idea is that those 4 quadrants, urgent and important, urgent and not important and urgent, and not important and not urgent, they demand our attention in different ways. So why is it called the Eisenhower Matrix? It is related to our former Allied general in the Second World War and 2-time president, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Yes, it is that. It is that Eisenhower. We get asked that question a lot. But he didn't invent it. What he did was come up with a phrase. And the phrase, just recently actually wrote an article about this. We'll pop them in the show notes. But the phrase, paraphrased here in this podcast, because I don't have in front of it, is that he had somebody mention to him that they often found that things that were urgent were not important, and things that were important were not urgent. That was it. That was the phrase. And it was in a speech actually in a religious setting, in a speech about something that had got nothing to do with this. And it was a short line and a much longer speech. And he returned to the idea like once or twice in a couple of articles and things like that, but never really beyond that. There was one other time where he was talking about the fact that leaders often had to deal with things that were urgent ahead of those things that were important, and
right.
that was a challenge. But nothing along the lines of the Matrix that I just described. Fast forward to, I think probably the early 80s, and Stephen Covey, somebody who
sure.
Many of us will be familiar with, and I've read every book he's got. He wrote a book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It's probably his most famous book.
Yeah.
In that book, there is a chapter, chapter 3, I think it is, called First Things First. And it's in that book that Covey creates the Eisenhower Matrix and credits Eisenhower's inspiration for that matrix. So that's kind of like how it all came about. And it is, if you like, a retrofit of a quote into a tool.
Yeah.
The bigger question, of course, is how useful is that tool?
Yeah. So when you first tried it, what worked and kind of what fell apart in real life, real application?
Well, I will say one thing. When I first encountered the Eisenhower Matrix, for me personally, it was kind of game-changing. And even though it is like super, super simple, right? I mean, The concept behind it really is you've got stuff. Not all that stuff is the same. And the stuff that is urgent and important is probably the stuff you should do first. And then quickly followed by the stuff that is important. And in Covey's book, they talk about the idea that it's, that you do now, the stuff you do, the stuff that is important but not urgent, you schedule, right? And that's an important piece of it. It's often missed, right? They say do now, do later, but not just do later, but schedule. In other words, find time to do it and actually do it, right? And then the other two quadrants are dealt with a little bit differently, and we, if we got time, we'll get into that. But I won't get into them right now because they're not as important. So,
There you go.
But I personally found it, like, even just as a mindset aid, like, incredibly valuable, because before then, personally, I would see a to-do list and I'd just work my way through it. And now I never see a to-do list. What I see when I'm working through things is a set of priorities that need to be worked through. That in itself is hugely valuable.
Yeah. So say I'm drowning in tasks. What's the simplest way to apply the idea today without over engineering quadrants?
Well, that's the first thing. Don't over engineer the quadrants, right? One of the things that was really, really interesting to us in my company is I love theory as much as the next person. My degree is in pure mathematics. I'll tell you that anybody that's got a degree in pure mathematics, I'll tell you everything you need to know. We don't like practical stuff, right? but for the purposes of my company, we do love practical stuff. And so one of the things we wanted to find out early on was, number one, how are people using the Eisenhower Matrix? And number two is, does it actually work for them?
Right.
And what we found, and this is something that I would urge people to avoid, is that the point you made about over-engineering quadrants, do not take this thing too literally. And so this is where I will mention the 4 quadrants. Theoretically, do now, urgent and important. Schedule, important but not urgent. Delegate, which is the ones that are not important but urgent. And then delete is there's lots of D's here. Delete, which is the ones that are not urgent, not important. 2 problems with using it in the way in which in that way specifically, and taking those things literally.
Yeah.
The first is, it kind of assumes that you've got enough time to work through all of that, right? And we're drowning in stuff to do, right? So we don't have time to get beyond the top part of that, right? The stuff that is urgent and important. If we've done all the stuff that's urgent and important, and we've done the stuff that's important, we're doing better than 99% of people, right?
Yeah.
The delegate stuff, right? People that are taking it literally get really hung up about this, because they've worked their way through the urgent and important stuff, which they have to do now. But if they want to actually delegate the stuff that is important but not urgent, they've got to get to that. Yeah. And if they want to delegate the stuff that is urgent but not important, that means figuring out if it is important to somebody else, figuring out who to delegate it to.
And then you got to explain it to them.
Yeah, and when are you going to do that? Because if you've been spending all your time doing those other things, by the time you get to it, you've probably passed the urgent window anyway. And so this is sort of where it starts to fall down when people take it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering too, is there ever a time when any of those quadrants in today's, they're never going to be empty?
No.
Something else is going to slot into it.
Precisely, yeah.
Yeah.
So what you want to do is you want to build systems that allow people to pick up the stuff that is important and urgent to them, right? So this is where shared Kanbans and things like that come into play. But you do not want to take on the responsibility of dealing with the delegation of those things. And so it pushes us towards, ironically, a pull system, right? It pushes us towards a system where it's visible, it's available, and if it's important to somebody and urgent for somebody, they'll be able to pick it up. So you need to have those systems in place. You need to have your team structured in such a way in which it works well. And then the other thing I think is you just need to be in a position where you're using it as a means of if you like, measuring yourself, right? Yeah. Your goal is to have less and less and less in that important and urgent phase, because with the very, very, very tiny number of exceptions, almost everything that is urgent and important was once just important. And they're up, like, we were, as a team, we were working through scenarios to try to figure out, like, are there any, right? And and we came up with earthquakes, right? Because earthquakes you can't necessarily predict, right? But they're extremely like, how you respond to them is urgent. How the specifics of how you respond to them in the moment are urgent and important at that time. But all the preparation you do, obviously, is not urgent and important. It's just important. So that's an example, but there are so few and far between of situations where There's no warning. There's nothing. There's nothing that you get to before stuff becomes urgent and important. So it's really useful as a tool to kind of like measure the effectiveness of your work, both as an individual and as a team.
Yeah, and since we're probably pulled towards urgent,
Yeah,
you have to design around that somehow, so the importance still happens.
Yeah, and this is actually where team dynamics come into play, and where that crucial word schedule comes into play, and not just do later, which is what you see in many of the models.
Yeah.
So schedule is vital. When I work with teams specifically, I'll start by looking at the priorities that they have as a team, and the first thing I'll say is like, you've told me that all of these priorities are important. Are they? Are they actually all important? Or have you written 6 because you think you should have 6? Or have you written 7 because you think you want a stretch goal in there or something along those lines, right? If they're not important, they're not going to get done anyway, so why have them there, right? If they are important, then that implies scheduling, regular scheduling, to make sure that they're done. Because if they're not, there will be an implicit order that you create, an implicit prioritization order, and the things that are at the bottom of that prioritization order will drop off the calendar.
Yeah.
We did an experiment early on, and we were looking at the amount of time that people spend on various aspects of their life. If you got below 2 hours a week of time that you intended to spend on something at the start of a week, the likelihood of you spending any time on it dropped down to almost 0. So you'd made this implicit thing, I'll spend an hour a week on it. And by spending an hour a week on it, your hour becomes 0.
Yeah.
It's like people who work out 1 day a week. Most often that's 0 days a week.
Yeah.
But if you work out 5 days a week, you're probably going to be able to sustain that better. It's counterintuitive because that's more effort. But the point is that you've told yourself and you've told others that this is important to you. If you're working out 1 day a week, you're telling yourself and others that it's not that important. Right. So what's 1 to 0, right? That's what you kind of have to do from a team dynamic as well. We say this is important. We're going to show that it's important by scheduling it, and we're going to devote enough time to it that we can move the needle forward on a weekly basis.
And in that team dynamic at a team level, what tells you that the group is maturing from reactive to proactive, and maybe like one ritual or something that helps them get there if they're not?
Yeah, I love that question. So we've sort of like alluded a little bit to this as teams already, but that's actually where the Eisenhower Matrix is super, super valuable, and probably just about its most valuable, right? If I can measure the number of things or the amount of time that I'm spending on activities that are urgent and important, and I can measure that from week to week and month to month, I'm maturing as a team when that amount of time gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So that's something an entire team can get behind, because like nobody loves fighting fires, right? So we say fires are preventable. Fires in our language here are things that are urgent and important. And we're gonna track it. We're gonna see how much urgent and important stuff we do. And if we're doing less of it, then we're maturing as a team. If we're doing more of it, we're going to get to root causes. And next time, we're going to make sure we are doing less of it. And here's the most interesting thing about it, Matt. So once teams start to do that, they go into this thinking that it's all external forces, right? Nothing to do with them, right? It's all external stuff. And yet, if they go through this exercise, once they start to get the urgent and important quadrant down, the amount of time that they're spending on urgent and important down, it tends to stay down, regardless of what happens. Regardless of what happens to those urgent and important things, because the people inside the team are motivated to keep it that way. So that's those things are directly related, right? Your maturity as a team and the amount of time you spend in that urgent and important quadrant. And you said ritual, so I'll address that briefly as well. The ritual is actually a really simple one, which is throw that at the start of your team meeting at least once a month, right? And where everybody's kind of reviewing what they are, and get people into the habit of like even if it's just a note that they mark down or whatever, right? I did this much work in the urgent and important quadrant this week, this day, this month. And then you can track all of that up together and then measure it at a team level. And then reward people as and when you're doing less of that urgent and important stuff.
Yeah. All right. Got some work to do. All right. Thank you, sir. Good episode. See you next time.
Cheers. Thanks, Matt.